The possibility that Jews served in large numbers in the Roman army is a startling find, since the Roman army is generally portrayed as an enemy to the Jewish nation. In various military campaigns, the Roman army destroyed the Holy Temple in Jerusalem in 70 CE and plundered its way through Judea to the last holdouts on Masada around 73 CE, in addition to military campaigns against the Jews in the 2nd century CE. The study requires that the public grapple with the likelihood that Jewish soldiers in the Roman army were part of the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. Julius Alexander, a Jewish general, was the second in command of the Roman army and oversaw the destruction. It's an uncomfortable fact, but it illustrates how people are complicated and divided, even thousands of years ago. According to researchers, there were an estimated 4.5 to 7 million Jews in the ancient Roman Empire around the 1st century, accounting for 5 to 15% of the population. As the empire expanded, the army needed soldiers for new campaigns and to maintain order across the empire, and the Jews were too large of a group to be given widespread exemptions. In 2014, an ostracon discovered in Egypt suggested that the Roman army may have actually gone out of its way to support minority soldiers in their observance of religious customs. The ostracon, etched letters on pottery, was a letter from a military officer named Tyrannus, who was in charge of obtaining supplies. The ostracon talked about temporarily sending wheat to the Jews rather than the military bread. The ostracon is dated to the 12th of Pharmuthi, a month that is parallel to the Hebrew month of Nisan, when the holiday of Passover occurs. Jews needed wheat because they abstained from bread and needed to make unleavened bread or other unleavened food. If this was indeed the reason for this request, it could have far-reaching implications. Primarily, this shows that the Romans acknowledged and respected the demands of some Jewish holidays, and that they were even ready to execute special tasks to allow for their observance. All empires needed men, and they also needed the minorities to serve. Jews, pagans, and all sorts of ethnic minorities were required to serve in the Roman army, and many did. All cultures throughout history had their own rules about what you can't eat or can eat. However, Jewish dietary laws are considered among the strictest and most complex. If Jews could find ways to serve while observing their dietary restrictions, other ethnic groups should be able to do the same. The full article can be found at the address listed in the video description.
That tracks. Roman Judea was part of the republic or empire like any other part. Romans also had garum containers that were marked for Jewish consumption. Kosher foods were prevalent all throughout the Roman Empire. Yeah, I'm not surprised at all. Rome was a multicultural civilization, and anyone who knows the story of the Passion knows Rome was well established in Judea by the time JC kicked/unkicked the bucket. This is true, but according to Josephus, Jews had issues with military service and public office because the Roman sacramentum, oath of allegiance, required swearing fealty to or acknowledging deity beside Yahweh. He says that Jews were offered exemptions for military service. Now we know this obviously wasn't always the case. According to Saint Tertullian, early Christians also had the same issue with the sacramentum. People have varying degrees of devotion and observance of religious mores. This is true. On historical subjects, it is often hard to remember the micro when we want to view everything as a macro for simplicity. Human civilization and society has always been as complicated as it is today. There's always been factions, minorities and majorities, differing opinions, and individuality. Despite thousands of years of difference, we are fundamentally the exact same people as the Romans, the early Jews, and the early Christians, with the entirely same capacity for difference of opinion and action. This is exactly correct. There were laws that required subjects of the empire to sacrifice in the name of the emperor, and Jews and early Christians wouldn't do it. The article goes on to state that they went as far to send wheat instead of bread during Passover, indicating a respect for religious beliefs. The Romans were actually quite respectful, in comparison to the rest of antiquity, of most of their vassals' religious beliefs during the Republic era. It wouldn't be till after the fall of the Republic that things would start to change to being more dominant of their vassals. The Romans were a highly superstitious bunch, so their logic was something like, what do we have to gain from offending these gods? Nothing? Then let's rather not. Which rest of antiquity? Due to polytheism, most ancient cultures seem to have no issues with different faith and incorporating them. Greeks did it, Persians did it, Romans did it. A bigger thing was elevation to citizenship, though that took centuries into the empire to happen. I'm more surprised that this wasn't already confirmed. I know the Roman legion regularly incorporated assimilated troops from held territories and allied states. It also included former slaves who had bought or been granted their freedom. It would only make sense that during the periods in which Rome held Judea that there would be a number of Jews in the Roman army. It is very interesting that Jews would be allowed to prepare meat according to kosher law, though. I imagine the bread and oil would already be kosher. If I remember my Bible correctly, the wine that Roman soldiers drank was often mixed with gall or myrrh, and when Jesus tasted that in the wine, he spat it out. Maybe that wouldn't have been kosher and they would have needed a wine prepared separately. Those would be auxiliaries, not legionaries. Part of the Roman army, but not Roman citizens. At least for most of the late Republic and early Empire, anyway. The Romans were pretty willing to let people do their own thing, so long as it didn't interfere with Roman rule. But to be a citizen meant being Roman. They were happy to assimilate other peoples into that. Yes, olive oil is already kosher. I'm sure they had no issues abiding by kosher standards for the Jewish soldiers. The only thing that makes it kosher is how it was killed, and whether it was maimed. A Jew doing the killing wouldn't really upset them. Bread would depend on the oven it was made in. Oil is kosher unless it was designated for religious use, Jewish or not. If not, then it's unusable for Jews. And wine they couldn't drink if a non-Jew handled an open wine. It about Jesus, but it could be that it being mixed was a sign that it was handled by non-Jews, not that it's an issue with the fall or myrrh itself. High numbers of Jews likely served in the legions that brought down Jerusalem and could have constituted even up to 15% of the vast empire's army. Is it startling? I thought they pretty much recruited auxiliaries from whatever provinces they had conquered. Interesting though, for sure. But didn't they usually serve elsewhere? Egypt had a substantial Jewish population, particularly in Alexandria. Perhaps they were not local? And right before the Roman Empire, the Ptolemies maintained large foreign contingents in their armies, because they didn't have enough Greeks to fill the role, and because they were hesitant to arm the native Egyptians who might then get ideas and kick out their Greek overlords. So they turned to inviting and recruiting foreigners. This included settled Galatian Gauls in the Fayum oasis and recruiting large numbers of Jews in their armies that they invited to settle in Alexandria. So there were Gauls living in Egypt 2,000 plus years ago? Yes. There was an invasion/mass migration by a tribe of Gauls across Greek territory, and they ended up settling in a territory around the capital of modern-day Turkey, and the region became named Galatia after them. Eventually the Greeks accepted them as a fact of life and they became well known as fierce warriors and hired as mercenaries. During Hellenistic times, the Ptolemies invited Gauls from this area to migrate to settle in Egypt and serve in their armies. A few hundred years later, in Roman times, their language was apparently still similar enough to the Gauls in France that missionaries from Galatia were sent to preach Christianity in Gaulish to the people in France. So the letter from Paul to the Galatians are Gauls? Wow! Thank you for taking the time to tell me about that. That's fascinating. Not every single person in Galatia would have been a Gaul, but yes, the Galatians are the people living in the region where the Gauls settled. They mostly did, but in case a local governor needed manpower quickly it happened that they were used for fighting close to home. Just look at the Mithridates Wars where Sulla recruited many of his men in Greece to fight Mithridates in eastern Greece and Asia, modern Turkey. Or, the infamous/famous Germanic uprising where Arminius was able to gather a vast coalition of tribes to fight Romans while serving as an auxiliary officer in his homeland. Yes. But wasn't the rule about auxiliaries not being permitted to serve in their homelands or nearby emerge partly as a result of Teutoburg-Wald? I think it was a result of the Germanic uprising, yes. But there were sizable Jewish populations all over the empire, so it could happen that Jews were recruited as auxiliaries or even legionaries all over the empire and served in the legions that put down the rebellion in Judea. The Jews also served for a long time in the military of various powers. There were military garrisons of Jews in some regions of the Seleucid Empire specifically because they were distinct from the neighboring population. I think that the same dynamic occurred with the Jewish garrison in Elephantine in southern Egypt under the Achaemenids. I love this kind of history, I think it's fascinating. Same with Vikings/Normans serving at Byzantium. Rechecking the wiki page on Elephantine Jews, they were apparently polytheistic. I know they worshipped Iao, a clear local variant of Yahweh, but for the other deities? More of that kind of thing. We have a Shiva gem found in Pompeii. When traveling to Karakorum in the mid-13th century, John of Rusbrook met with a French court jeweler. His brother was still living in Paris. And recent research suggests a Frankish influence on Yuan court jewels through that guy. I had to go check that Elephantine wasn't some weird typo, which led to a very interesting read. Small mistake, the jeweler had a brother with a workshop in Paris. Not just a friend. Somebody also calculated the network described by Sogdian merchants and got 5 million square kilometers as a result. In the early 7th century the Turks extracted a silk tribute from Chinese, so they asked Sogdian merchant to sell it to the Persians. The Persians refused and a merchant sent a letter to the Khan that they had to go all the way to the west to reach Crimea, cross the Black Sea and sell the silk in the land of the Romans, as no other people use as much silk. All of that to say that I find those stories as fascinating as you. Yeah, this really shouldn't surprise anyone. The Roman Empire, much like Achaemenid Persia, was built on ruling diverse groups of people by integrating them into their empire without destroying their identity and then using that population for further military conquest. Every group they ever had in their empire served in their army, both the auxiliary and the legions. Interesting that in another part of the conversation someone mentions the Elephantine Jewish mercenaries who seem to have worked for Persia at one point. Also not surprising. If you haven't listened to King of Kings by Dan Carlin, it is definitely worth a listen and goes into why Persia was so successful in building such a huge and diverse empire in this manner. It also ultimately fell apart when later rulers undid all the goodwill that had been built. That does sound like one to listen to, thanks. I think the article is misinformed and likely whoever wrote it did not properly understand the study they're referring to. Legionaries were only selected from Roman citizens. Most provincials weren't granted citizenship until the Edict of Caracalla in 212 AD. So there's really no way Jewish legionaries could have been assaulting the walls of Jerusalem in 70 AD. If there were any Jews on the Roman side at that point, they would have been auxiliaries. What the study is likely referring to is either those auxiliary units, or legionaries from the late Roman Empire, which weren't as well equipped and not generally what most think of when imagining a Roman legionary. It is possible that some Jewish soldiers were legionnaires even if the majority were auxiliaries. Auxiliaries and their children were granted Roman citizenship if they completed their service requirements. So there could have been Jewish legionnaires who were re-enlisted auxiliary, or were the children of Jewish auxiliary soldiers who were granted citizenship. Also, the late Roman legions could be just as well equipped if not better equipped than the earlier legions. The late legions had access to armor that covered more of the body, e.g. chainmail with longer sleeves, access to new armors like lamellar, access to longer swords, etc. The Romans also adopted super heavy cavalry/cataphracts by the late Empire. How did the Roman army function if auxiliaries spoke foreign languages? Did they all learn Latin? Was the unit 100% made up of men speaking the same language? Officers could be bilingual nobility. Greek was very likely the common language between them. By then many Jews were speaking Greek. I've gone backcountry camping with Jewish friends before, but I've never seen one keeping kosher on the trip. I'm kinda curious how hard that would be, both then and now. If you bring your own food, there is no problem. If you want to live off the land, then it's vegetables and fish. There are lots of places where that is very doable. Most of North America below the permafrost line.
Thank you for listening to the end. Subscribe and like. Bye.